Thank you. So welcome everybody to the Rosen JCC. I know for a couple people it's their first time here, and I'm excited that you got a chance to come down and to see it. And if you want to talk at all about the Rosen JCC with Ruben afterwards, I'm sure he'll be happy for a brief time because he'll probably want to go home. But all the things that they're doing here, it's an important part of our community. So we're glad that we're able to be here this evening. Tonight is the second presentation of the 2020-2021 Orlando Jewish Community Study. We were very lucky to be able to work with the Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies on this study. It is an incredible amount of research. Dr. Saxe, Dr. Len Saxe will be talking about it. Is Matt on the Zoom as well?
He's fine.
Oh, good. And Dr. Matt Boxer, you see in Boston, it's still light somehow magically. And the two, Matt did most of the actual data collection and survey. Len, besides being the 30,000 foot view on this, is also the preeminent researcher in the country, really in the world, when it comes to Taglit, Birthright Israel, and to Jewish summer camps. And so he brings that piece in to talk about our community as well, which as you'll hear, is important in terms of where we are and where we really want to go. So again, this has been a long process to get to here. I encourage you, if you haven't done it yet, if you go to the Federation's website, jfgo.org, you can download a copy of the full study. You can download a copy of the technical appendices. You can download the 20-page summary document if you want just that. And tonight's presentation, the PowerPoint, will also be uploaded as well if it isn't already. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Len and Matt and let them share their findings.
So thank you, Keith, and thank you to the community for allowing us to work with you to study the community. I've been talking, I'm a little bit hoarse, it feels like for the last 24 hours nonstop about these data. I'm going to go through the study pretty quickly tonight, but the purpose is not as much for me to give you information as for us to have a conversation. And I'm excited that a number of you are here, and we can have a conversation. And I also welcome those of you who are online. Probably the easiest thing is to post questions on the chat, and Matt over here, over my shoulder, will try to answer them, or will pass them on to me. If you will move to the first slide, this can be hard if I can't see what you're doing. So I'm going to have to look over my shoulder to make sure that I know what's here. So we did this study, and we collected lots of information. We talked to 1,400 or almost 1,400 people in the Central Florida, greater Orlando area. I'll show you the picture of the geography that the study covered. And from these 1,400, we're going to generalize, and we're going to talk about the behavior, the attitudes, some of the beliefs of the people who make up this community. I'm going to say it at some point, so I'll say it at the top. Demography is not destiny. What we're going to show you is a picture, a snapshot, if you will, of the community at one point in time. It's actually an odd time to be doing a study because we were collecting the data in the midst of the COVID pandemic. So a lot of the ways in which people engage in their Jewish identity, the Jewish community, were somewhat different. We tried to be sensitive to that, asking questions about what you did in the past and future, but that's a piece of the context that you need to understand. We think we got a sample, the 1,400, that represent the community, and we use some fancy and complex statistics to make sure that it's a representative sample. But we're going to give you estimates of what we think the behavior, the attitudes, the beliefs of people are. we call them confidence intervals around these estimates. And we want you to focus on the big differences, comparisons, not what we call the specific point estimates. Anyway, these are the issues that we're going to cover. We can go to the next slide. I'm going to start in a second by talking about our estimates of the population. I want to make clear, Len Saxe, Matt Boxer, we don't believe that the number of people is the critical piece of information about you, about any community. But it is important because it gives us the denominator. It gives us the number that we can use to assess the extent to which people are enacting their Jewish identity, those people who we call Jewish. So we're going to start with that, and then we're going to go and look at a whole bunch of other issues. I invite questions as we proceed. Don't worry about derailing the conversation. I'll push us back to our agenda as quickly as I can. Okay, next. So just a bit about the methodology. We developed a survey based both on the questions that are used in surveys of other communities. Some of them were even used in the Pew survey, their latest 2020 portrait of US Jewry. We had a relatively high response rate, much higher than Pew did, and that gives us some confidence that our estimates accurately represent the community. Next, please. Next, please. So key findings. So we'll start with the key findings, and I'll start with the demographics. Next. So our estimate of the current population of this Central Florida area, greater Orlando community, is a little bit over 51,000 Jewish individuals, adults and children, living in 25,000 households. And importantly, in these households live non-Jews, spouses, as well as children who are not being raised in any way Jewish. And that brings the total population of the community closer to 70,000, 41,700 Jewish adults, and almost 10,000 Jewish children, and then another 3,900 non-Jewish children living in Jewish households. I should be obvious why I mention this, because many of these children are actually halakhically Jewish. Many of these children could receive, all of them could receive Jewish education and be Jewish. They are part of the community, however we define them. We're using standard definitions, sociological definitions of who's Jewish. It's not the halakhic definition. It's asking people to self-identify as Jewish. And if they self-identify as Jewish, and I'm going to put it, have a good reason to say that they're Jewish, Jewish parentage, Jewish education, conversion, etc. For the purposes of this study, they are counted. And we're doing something that's very, very similar to what Pew did and what most other demographers now do. Questions, comments? Are we
curious on the methodology? How many came in electronically versus how many were phone calls? I saw that
we collected all of the data online. We did allow for interviews, but today you can't talk to people on the phone.
Lists that were purchased were email lists or whatever.
Right, they were.
Plus what the Jewish Org locally provided.
Right, and we have a variety of ways to assure that that's representative, and we use what we call enhanced RDD, random digit dialing, We collect data from hundreds and hundreds of national studies where people have been asked questions about their religion, ethnicity, and we use that as a basis to adjust our estimates.
Hey, Mike?
Yeah.
Do you have, I know the last study you did was 28 years ago. Do you have in some of the stats how much it's grown since then?
So yes, I think the community has grown 175% since 1993. And interestingly, because we looked at the census data, it tracks exactly what the highly educated white non-Hispanic population has grown in the community. So the growth of the Jewish community, which is pretty extraordinary over an 8-year period, matches exactly what the growth of the Orlando area is. And it is one of the fastest growing areas in the country. Okay, next please. Ooh.
Oops. I'm gonna just turn your mic up a little. When you are speaking, if you can speak hot, just a little louder so that everybody online can also hear, that would be
Okay, or I'll try to repeat questions. Yes.
Can
perfect.
you clarify what a Jewish household is?
Jewish household is a household that has one Jewish adult. So if there's one Jewish person who's an adult, 18 or over, and they meet our criteria, they say that they're Jewish, and they have a good reason to say that they're Jewish, because we ask them those as well, then that's considered a Jewish household. Then the question was, what do we consider a Jewish household? Okay, next please. So, ooh. Thank you. So here's a map of the area, just to give you a picture of the area that we covered. This was not our decision. This was the Federation decision. It's primarily, am I correct, 2 counties. And the most important thing about this map is that these dots, you can't read them here, but if you go online, you can blow up in that. Each dot, each red dot represents 25 households. And what you can see is that the densest area is in the middle, which is Maitland Winter Park. And that at the same time, particularly here in the Southwest, there's a great spread of people. There's no concentration based on housing, et cetera. The map doesn't do justice to how close or far people are, because conditions on I-4 or the other highways are probably more important than the exact numbers of miles that people are away from one another. But it does suggest that serving the community has a geographic challenge associated with it in terms of how far people are from location. And you see here where the percentages of people are located. Okay, next please. 2/3 of the households are essentially a couple, 2 adult Jews. The majority of the coupled households are composed of 1 Jewish and 1 non-Jewish person. At the same time, in terms of Jewish children, because it is universal that in-married parents raise Jewish children, and it is not quite as universal amongst intermarried. Most of the Jewish parents, most of the Jewish children are being raised by in-married Jewish parents. Next. This is just a picture of what the household composition looks like. You can check it out later on. Next, please. So one of the findings of the study, and I'm going to use this to illustrate one of our central takeaways, is that there is a relatively low level of engagement with synagogues, that 16% of the community reports that they are part of a worship community, that they are members or otherwise actually affiliated with a worship community. That, and before you tell me that brick and mortar is the wrong term, yes, it's not the right term, but the traditional membership of brick and mortar synagogues that have lay boards and hire clergy members, that
They're working on problem of God.
I got this.
Problem I got next door.
I got it. As long as they don't come in here, I got it. It's fine. About half, a little bit less than half, are member of what we're going to call brick and mortar synagogues. Half are part of Chabad communities, and then there are a scattered few who are part of independent minyanim. There are some who are members of synagogues in some other place. They've probably moved from there here. It's a little hard to do this with them. But haven't joined or become part of a synagogue here. I think, to just put it on the table, this rate is very different than the rate of worship community membership engagement in other communities. The national average is 35%, according to Pew 2020. And it's illustrative of the lack of organizational engagement of people in the greater Orlando, Central Florida area. Next. Yeah.
Was there any other parallels on data between, was any other parallels that you were able to draw that would rhyme with this? So to
Yes,
speak?
so that's
Age, demographic perhaps, or intermarriage?
just
Just
relax for one
Thank you, sir.
second and we'll show you in detail. But this is clear, I gather. Okay. Next, please. Oops. So one of the things that we have done, my group, Matt Boxer, my team at Brandeis over the last couple of years, is that first of all, we want to understand patterns of behavior. We just, one number, factoid, whether it's synagogue membership or how many b'nai mitzvah or whatever it is, how many people have traveled to Israel, doesn't help us understand the fabric of what Jewish life is in most communities. Furthermore, the traditional ways in which we look at people in these communities, breaking them down, for example, by denomination, or whether they're intermarried or inmarried, that also doesn't really tell us who these people are. By the way, with denomination, one of the issues is that the largest denomination now is no denomination, that people refuse to be categorized as Orthodox, Masorti, conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, and so on. So what we decided to do was to take what they tell us about the actual behaviors that they engage in, and using some fancy multivariate statistics, see whether people fall out into different groups. So we created, next slide. We created, based on their responses, 5 groups. We've given them names here. One group we call the personal Jewish group. Next group we call the family Jewish group. And basically, this comprises 60% of the Orlando Jewish community. These are people who do some Jewish, not a lot of Jewish necessarily, but some Jewish, but they do it outside of organizational contexts. They do it at home. They do it, the family group, they do it with their family. They do some individual stuff, but they don't step foot, if you will, in a synagogue, in formal Jewish organizations. And this is a bit unusual. So this is, in terms of jibing with other data, this fits with the synagogue lack of affiliation data. There are three other groups. Most important, perhaps, is the immersed group, 6%, relatively small proportion of the community, who participate in all aspects of Jewish life, in ritual, in community life, in cultural life. And that's what the behaviors are about, and I'll show you that in a second. And then there are two other groups, one which we call the holiday group. They actually do go to shul for the Chagim, for example, and an involved group, but they're not an immersed group. They're very involved in Jewish life, but not necessarily in all aspects of Jewish life. Next slide, please. So this is the actual, I'm going to try to step aside here so you can see this. These are the actual behaviors that we were looking at, and we just picked them out of lots of the behavioral questions that we asked in the survey. And what you can see here, the darker the square, the darker the color of the square, the more people do that particular behavior. And you can see over on the right-hand side, the immersed folks do lots of everything, from synagogue, again, to the cultural things, to volunteering, to reading Jewish materials, et cetera, et cetera. At the other end, you've got the personal and the familial folks. And remember, these are the majority of the members of the community who do relatively few of these things. But interesting, for example, the family, the familial group Jews, most of them, virtually all of them, participate in Sederim. All of them participate in Hanukkah. They don't belong to synagogues. They don't do those kinds of things, but they do these Jewish things. So they're not simply Jews in name only. They're doing some Jewish things. And you've got various degrees of the other things. What we're hoping for is not only for validation of some of the factoids, like the percentage of people who are synagogue members, but we're hoping that you can use this information about what we call patterns of engagement as a window, as a door to engage them in other ways in the community. Yeah.
I was looking at the personal one. What constitutes the second to the bottom Jewish cultural activities?
So these are a variety of things. Do you read Jewish books? Do you watch Jewish movies? You know, we could ask, we didn't ask here, but, you know, did you watch Dissel, through Game or what have you? I mean, in the way that Jewish film has become a thing. It's become a way that lots of American Jews connect with both Judaism, but also with Israel. I don't know, Matt, if I can ask you, what were the specific cultural activities, or how was that question framed?
So it's not based on a single question. It's based on, did you do any of these things, or some index of how frequently you did them. But the items that we looked at are, I believe it's talking with family or friends about Jewish topics. Let's see, it's reading Jewish publications, newspapers, magazines, newsletters from Jewish organizations. Oh, actually, that one is the read Jewish material item. That one's separate. It's reading books, watching movies or TV, listening to music that is Jewish focused, eating Jewish foods aside from Shabbat and holiday meals. I think that's the list. Yeah.
So any question that you ask on a survey, it's a representative of a lot of other questions, and we just picked a couple. And what's important is the comparison, the fact that some personal Jews do this. Now, almost all immersed Jews that do that, but film, books, literature, etc., all of the things on that list are, again, ways, are entry points to engaging you.
We do have a question from the audience online, which is, are the 31% broken down by the age?
Yes, so we have all sorts of breakdowns in the report. I forget exactly whether I included that slide in this particular presentation, but now what we're doing is using this sort of in lieu of questions like denomination or in marriage, intermarriage. So yes, and in the report, you'll find it if I don't do that. And you can come back and ask the question later on, and Matt can probably tell you exactly. Okay, next, please. So this is an illustration, for me anyway, of why the denominations, just knowing what denomination a person is, isn't all that useful, because what you see here, well, this is a little bit cut off, but you can imagine the group names: personal, familial, holiday, involved, immersed, on the left-hand side. And what you see here is, well, not surprisingly, those who the immersed group includes the Orthodox, but it also includes Masorti, conservative, Reform, and other people. You read across, this is of this group, that's to 100 on the right-hand side. And what this shows is that, if you will, some of our stereotypes about what different kinds of Jews do, it's not directly tied to their denomination. Some of the reason that this number is a double-digit number is that there are more Reform Jews than there are Jews of other stripes, even with the no denomination folks. Next, please. Yeah.
Well, you go back to the previous one.
Go back to the previous slide.
What is the other and the none on top?
So this is somebody who says they're not, they're another kind of denomination. This could be Reconstructionist, humanist, all sorts of things. The nones, in our case, in Jewish study, these are people who say, I am not a denomination. I'm just Jewish. I'm something else. So this group is increasingly large. It's a little bit larger in this community than it is in national studies. I think in Pew, the none category was 32%. Although this is one that is that intersects with age. The younger you are, the more likely you are to say that you are no denomination. Good. Okay, so let's go ahead. This is the more detail about the children and how they're being raised, and we had all sorts of possibilities, from Jewish alone, Jewish in another religion, not Jewish, and again, not again, but as I said earlier, this gives you some sense of what the market is out there to engage children. It's not the people who are being raised with no religion are not like the people of previous generations, particularly from intermarried families, who were being raised as Christians or some other faith. The competition is for nothing or for none, rather than for another faith. Very, very few people who identify as Jewish are raising children in called a competing faith community. Next, please. Why don't we just go on to the next one? So this is the detail of how children in in-married and intermarried families are being currently raised. As I said earlier, in in-married families, it's almost universal that they consider their kids Jewish and they're raising them Jewishly. In intermarried families, the largest group are people who are being raised Jewish alone. And in fact, just a side comment here, we'll consider this a footnote to this slide. One of the dramatic changes that's happened over a space of a generation is that we went from a situation where the children of intermarriage were very likely to consider themselves as Jews once they became adults, once they turned 18. Less than 30% of the generations before the millennials. Millennial generation, basically the generation that came of age beginning in the year 2000. That generation, 60%, and we believe now it's even higher, closer to 70% of the people in who were born essentially after 1981 as adults consider themselves Jewish. How much Jewish they do, that's a separate question, but they consider themselves Jewish. And that's a sea change, an absolute sea change from the situation that existed before. But here you see 44% Jewish only and about a third no religion. Next, please.
Before we go on, we have a question, which is what percentage of children are in an intermarriage household?
Matt?
It was on one of the previous slides. So I know of Jewish children, it was 38% are in an intermarried household. In terms of percentage of all children, I believe it was 57%. Does that sound right to you, Len?
It does. And we can talk about the intermarriage situation because obviously at the end when we talk about some of the implications of this, how the community deals with intermarriage is potentially important. This is what the slide that's up now is what children, how they are being schooled. 12% of the age eligible children are in a Jewish preschool. It's consistent with the lower level of synagogue affiliation, and been talking with a number of groups over the last 24 hours about the importance of preschools and developing preschools, because preschools are, for many families, the entry point into Jewish communities and in particular to synagogues. Next, please. So just this is a quick tour. For today, in this slide, we're into philanthropy. Half of the households, the Jewish households that we interviewed, say that they donated to a Jewish charity, philanthropy, but 30% of Jewish households say they didn't donate, they only donate to non-Jewish causes. Next. This is a list of the organizations to which donations go. And not surprisingly, religious organizations are the central focus of philanthropy. Next, please. We're unfortunately in a situation where anti-Semitism, which some people thought had been eliminated, at least from the United States, the virus has mutated. It's appeared in all kinds of new forms. And we asked people whether they had personally been exposed to anti-Semitism. In some ways, any number greater than 0 is too large a number. And we collected lots of data about the ways in which people feel, it's a single digit number, but almost 10%, are exposed directly to anti-Semitism. And you can read some of the details in the report. Obviously, in this day and age, and given the broader culture, and not just Charlottesville, Pittsburgh, Poway, Jersey City, et cetera, an issue of great concern. Next. We also did a lot of, we had a number of questions asking people about their participation in Jewish programs. Here's a display. I won't go through the specific numbers, showing by group. It's more validation of how our grouping of behaviors really is suggesting that there are very different patterns of being involved in the community. Next, please. And this is, I took out some of the geographic information, and perhaps for this audience, I should have put some of it back in, but this is the percentages by the 4 geographic areas. Lots more detail in the report about this. Next, please. And again, these are the types of programs. One of the things I'll focus on for a moment is online activity. That there was some hope. Remember, COVID, the pandemic, arrived on our shores and blew up several weeks before Pesach in 2020. And one of the first concerns of the Jewish community was the disruption that the pandemic was causing to families for whom Seder and observance of Pesach was a central part of the tradition. And there was a hope that once we realized that we weren't going to be able to get together with family in the way that we normally do, that online Sederim, that online Jewish education, that online participation for particularly the unengaged would really make a difference. It would open up lots of opportunities. And I think what we've seen is that, and not only in this study, but in national studies that we have done, that online stuff works best for those people who are already engaged. If you don't know what Jewish education is about, if you don't have it in your kishkes to appreciate Jewish thought, Jewish observance, and so on, it is very hard to teach that online. And so another work we've done makes it absolutely clear that the Jewish community, which has been built on actual interaction, Matt and I call Judaism a contact sport. Judaism is meant to be done in groups, in communities. That's how we organize ourselves. And online is no substitute, particularly for the people who don't already have that habit built into them, baked into them. Next, please. This is membership in organizations, same kind of patterns. Next. And this is the breakdown by geographic area. This is a comparison of, this is first of all the report of the membership, the proportion of the community that are members either of Roth or Rosen. relatively small proportions of the community. So whoever is listening, lots of opportunity to market what you do. The difference here, I was asked last night about it, the fact that at Rosen, the people who reported participating in children and families programs is higher, probably has more to do with the number of cultural programs that you have than the size of the programs themselves. Again, for those who, yeah.
Can you just explain the lower numbers, the 55, 45, 42, 29, and so on? What are those percentages of?
So those are, we asked people, if you remember, what did you do and what kinds of programs did you participate in? And could have been participated in multiple programs, and trying to get a sense. This was an omnibus survey of the whole community. It wasn't an evaluation or a marketing study for any particular organization. So this was a way to get a sense of what is it that, if you're a member, what are you using? What needs are the community centers?
So the number 45% of those that reported to be members of the JCC?
Right. Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Oh, that was a long-winded answer to a simple question. Sorry about that. Okay, next, please. And so I'm going to wrap up with some of the needs of the community. Again, as I said at the top of this, we did this study during the pandemic, and lots of things were different. One of the things that was different is that people lost jobs. While the community overall is well off, and some members of the community are doing, from an economic, financial point of view, just fine, what we saw here, and it's the case across the country, is that if you were, I call it living on the edge before the pandemic made your situation much worse. If you were doing okay, you were fine. And so what you see here is just about 20% of the community said they weren't making it, or they were just managing to make ends meet. We had a question, it's been used on other surveys. Do you have $400 of savings in case of emergency? And blocking on the exact number. Matt, help me here. Is it on the next slide?
I believe it is, but it should be 17% in case it's not.
Okay, so hopefully 17% will appear in the next slide. 17% of the population.
Do you want me to switch to the next slide?
Sure, we'll see.
Oh, I was wrong. It's 15%.
That's what I thought. 15% of the community doesn't have $400 in case of an emergency. Now, this may not, we're hopefully coming out at the end of the dark tunnel into light, but it's a pretty scary number from my perspective, and an illustration of, if we believe in the value of our responsibility toward one another, that the Jewish community has lots to do. So this is some of the benefits that people were receiving. Over a third of the community were reporting economic hardship. Yeah.
I just had a question, since all the relevant parties listen to me here. Does our community have any kind of grant program, whether like actual money? Like, obviously we have Jewish Family Service, and we do a lot to support. We have done a lot to support people in need over the past 2 years with food and all this. But addressing that insufficient savings for a $400 expense, like does either JCC or the Federation or Allow Movement have actually, like, someone can apply for a grant and receive $500 or $1,000 if they really need it? Sure.
But in our community, I can tell you that anytime someone needs, they reach out, and we very often we use the picture.
Sorry.
Most of the places where that is within synagogues. Jewish Family Services, during the pandemic, there was federal money available to help with rent and to help with other type of things that were made available, and they processed it. But outside of that, it really falls mostly within synagogues where that need gets taken care of. Now, there are obviously, there have been, I can speak about the Roth JCC, I'm assuming it would be the same as the Rosen, but when there are members that have challenges, we take care of them. Similar to what Rabbi was saying, that, you know.
So let me just, I realize that people may not online have heard. The question was, does the community have resources to support people, for example, who don't have $400 in the case of emergency? And one of the answers was Chabad makes available to anybody who has such a need the responsibility from Keith Orchik. The answer was yes, the community has these resources, although parallel to the comment about Chabad, the resources often come through synagogues. Is that a reasonable summary?
Except they're not Chabad.
That they're not Chabad.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Orlando Forest Center.
I did have one question, which is
Sure.
any economic hardship number over here is 36, but on the prior page, you had those that are barely making it or not making it somewhere in 19.
Right. So
Just
this,
curious.
there was a separate question, and
I'm
Matt,
just saying, those that are barely making it or just making it, presumably that category would be the ones that have an economic hardship. Those that are, we have enough money, so to speak, presumably would not fall within any economic hardship, and that's where I'm trying to understand that correlation.
right. So I forget the exact time period that we used. Matt, what the question was the difference between the 36% and the 19%.
Yeah, the discrepancy is that there are some number of households who said that financially they're fine, they're okay, they have enough money. But we asked separate questions about different kinds of hardship, including was there a change in your employment status? Did you lose your job? Did your hours get cut? Did your pay get cut? That is a particular type of hardship. And some number of the folks who said they're financially okay did experience that hardship. Some of them also experienced some of the other hardships you see here on the screen. Change in health was a particularly important one, given that we were going through a life-threatening pandemic. And some people in the community did cite that as the economic hardship. They caught COVID, and that had, at least for a short time, if not, thank goodness, in most cases, not permanently, but it had a significant impact on their finances in the short term.
Does that 80% number correlate to other cities where 80% either have enough money or more than enough money or are affluent? Is that correlating to other communities in the US?
Roughly, although I think Orlando may have been hit worse because so much of the economy is dependent on tourism and so on, and that was one of the things. And it changed. One of the problems that we had is that every time we developed questions, something else would happen. So when we first started doing the study, and we did for those who are interested, in the summer or beginning in May of 2020, we did a study of almost 15 communities looking at how COVID was affecting them. And actually, even over the period we were in the field, May to August, the situation was changing as COVID, which hit the Northeast and the West Coast hardest at the beginning, where the physical hardship, the death, the hospitalizations and so on were much worse than the rest of the country. But then that changed by the summertime. So it depends exactly when you did the study.
We have a few comments and questions from the chat.
Sure.
So first of all, we have a comment from Rabbi Dubov, who said Chabad has an ongoing meal campaign to the needy as well as financial stipends. So that answers the Chabad conversation.
So I was right.
So you were right. And then we have a question. Do you have an age breakdown of those struggling from your previous slide? So in the full report, is there an age breakdown for those struggling?
Okay. Matt?
I don't believe we had that in the report, but we do have it in the comparison charts, which are at present downloadable off of our website. We have most of the key variables in the survey broken down by age, by engagement group, by geography, synagogue members versus non-members, in-married versus intermarried versus not married, and whether or not there are children in the household.
And it also seems that this particular issue and concerns regarding this insecurity of some of the families and the percentage of families, would another survey have to be done in order to make decisions regarding the needs of the community, to really support the community because of the pandemic and how it skews the survey? I hope I'm...
So I don't want to say, of course, because we need more work. That's not the issue. I want to make 2 points. One is that the primary purpose of this study, like the U.S. Census, was to develop a demographic profile of the community and to figure out the size of the community, the rough shape of the community. To the extent possible, we asked all of these other questions. But there are lots of policy decisions that need to be made where you really have to focus in. I mean, for example, the JCC may need to do its own studies of the people who use the JCC to figure out who's using what and how they feel about the panoply of services that are available. I do think that the economic and health needs of the community probably needs its own study. Some of the data from here can, like where Jews live and what their rough economic situation gives you it's like the census gives you the sense of where you should be looking. But this was an omnibus survey, and I want to be absolutely clear. We may have underestimated the financial and some of the healthcare needs, because exactly the people who we want to study are also the most difficult to reach, no matter what clever tools we use to reach people. So yes, but I think the goal, the hope is that this gives you the rough map, blueprint, structure to look at the community. Was there another question?
I'm just checking. All right, we're good.
Good. Okay, next. So this is the health issues among the households where there is a chronic health issue, chronic illness, physical disability, mental illness, and the percentages. Next. And then just finally, something about the subgroups of the community, the fact that the community is diverse. There are Israeli Americans, American Israelis, there are LGBTQ members of the community. And I don't like the third category. It's something that's emerged over the last several years. And it's a result of the census and how the census classifies people. But Latin American, Jews, people of color, they're part of the community, and understanding and appreciating the diversity is one of the roles of demographic studies, so we include some information about them. That should be now the last one. So there's a chapter in the report. I won't go into it in detail because I'd rather have a conversation with you about some of these issues. But we were asked for some recommendations, and I'm going to summarize them, or I'm going to give you my quick take on them. I think the community, the Greater Orlando Jewish community, is not as much of a community as it needs to be to serve the needs of the Jewish population. The cooperation among organizations, the lack of people's feeling of connection to the community, to community organizations, is it's different than other communities. The fact that you've got 60% of your community, the familial, the personal Jews who don't have interaction with communal organizations is, for me, the piece of what I hope people will take away from this and think about: how do we create community? How do we create connections among people? How do we create connections, maybe starting with among the organizations that serve the community? So I welcome your comments, questions, arguments, whatever. That's part of the process. And also from pointing to the computer, for those of you on Zoom, if you have comments, questions, etc., I'm happy to take them, and I'll ask Matt to help me field them.
I just have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, the survey that was given out, how did people respond to it? Were they solicited, and I guess, and how many were sent out if they were solicited? What percentage of people did respond?
So overall, we showed you the response rate, which is close to 30%, around 30%. We had different samples. We had list samples, but we randomly sampled from those. We purchased data about people who are likely to be Jewish, to reach out to them. So we use a whole bunch of methods to get people. People responded online, although they could be interviewed as well by phone.
So I guess I was trying to understand, what does it mean? Why do people respond? What do they, especially the ones that are so not affiliated with any of the most organizational parts? So what would be their goal of responding? And what must we learn from that, I guess?
So my training is in psychology. I'm a social psychologist. I like to say I was either born or became a social psychologist. And there's a little secret about human behavior, and that is people love to talk about themselves. And so asking people, and perhaps in a Jewish way. So part of it is finding ways to engage people and giving voice to people who want to be influential. It is more and more difficult to get people to respond to surveys, but the beauty of surveys is that we know enough about probability to be able to ask a few people questions and then generalize, extend it to larger population. Doing these studies is very difficult. Political polling is, by contrast, easy. Because first of all, we know exactly what the characteristics of the population are. We have all kinds of information about who's in the population, so we know who we're not getting, except for their religious affiliation, because the census doesn't collect that information. But also with the case of political polls, if you will, there is this is bad metaphor. I won't use the bad metaphor that I was going to use. You get an answer about whether you're correct or not in the first Tuesday of November, because you see how people vote and you can see how close they are. And political polls, for all the criticism that they get, they are pretty accurate, gauging the response of people, and when they're inaccurate. People spend a lot of time trying to figure that out. That's what we've tried to do, or the equivalent of that, with these kinds of surveys. Other questions, comments?
Is there any multilingual use? Let's say for Israelis, for example, was it available?
Yes. So typically, Matt will have to tell us what that was in this case. Did we do any Hebrew surveys, Russian surveys, Spanish surveys?
We did not do any Hebrew surveys. All the Israelis we found were initially contacted in English and were willing to do the survey that way. I believe we did a handful of surveys in Russian. I don't believe we needed to do any interviews in Spanish, though we might have. Part of my challenge remembering is we've done about a dozen of these studies in the last year, and I don't always remember which surveys we actually did Spanish language interviews and which ones we didn't.
But in general, in our surveys, we offer people the option, and we've done everything from Farsi to Russian to Hebrew to Spanish. I think most frequently Russian has been the language that people are more comfortable answering surveys in. And that may actually have to do with their motivation to do surveys in the first place. Speaking in Russian gives them a sense of comfort or whatever that, that this is legit. But others, yeah.
Your statistics on intermarriage versus in-marriage, I even picked it up last night, more intermarriage.
Intermarriage, yes.
How does that work with other Jewish communities and nationally?
So it's pretty close, I think, to other Jewish communities. Remember, I call it the arithmetic of marriage. It only takes one Jewish person in an intermarriage. It takes two Jewish persons in an in-marriage. And so you're going to have, so we report both the individual rate and the couple rate, but you're going to have lots of intermarriage because, even if half the people, half the Jewish population intermarries, you're going to have a lot more intermarried families, a lot more intermarried couples.
We have a question online.
Yeah.
In studies of comparable sized communities where the percentage of Jewish affiliation involvement is similar, what have they done to increase the percentage of involved Jews?
So Matt may have a different answer. I'll give you my answer first, and then it can be corrected if necessary. I don't think we had a similar community study where the level of engagement was quite as limited as we found here. Now, but at the same time, Orlando is a totally different community. It's a community that grew up in the last 25 years, and lots of people moved here. It's not like your population was born here and there were all sorts of institutions going back to the 19th century that were supported by the Jewish community. So, and also, the size of the community is a little bit deceptive because, depending on how the geographic lines, there's some places, I come from New Jersey. New Jersey, from a Jewish perspective, is like the Balkans. Every county and whatever, and even subpart, there's been some consolidation over the years, but they have lots of different federations, and so it's a different situation. But I think, honestly, I don't recall a community with quite the profile that this community has. Are you going to correct me, Matt, or am I basically on track?
I think you're basically on track. There have been smaller communities with similar low levels of engagement. There aren't a lot of studies of very small Jewish communities. I know this specifically in part because coming from Niagara Falls, where there are about as many Jews today as there are people on Zoom for this presentation, I know from small communities, and so what's been done in some of those places, it sort of becomes a question of what do you know people are interested in, and how can you get them to do those things in Jewish settings? So, for example, another community that has grown up in the last 25, 30 years or so is Naples, in Southwest Florida. This is a community that realized they did not have very high levels of engagement, and so even before we conducted their study in 2017, they started a club called, first it was the Women's Cultural Alliance, and then the Men's Cultural Alliance followed along. They just started presenting cultural programming because that's what their population was interested in. It didn't necessarily have to be Jewish cultural programming, though they worked their way up to that. These were mostly seasonal residents who were coming from other parts of the country. They were retiring to Naples. They wanted to have access to the same kinds of cultural amenities as they had in New York or Chicago or wherever else it was they were coming from. And this was a way of getting them involved in the Jewish community before they got deeply involved in the general community around them. And it led to much, much higher engagement in the community. Your community has been around longer than theirs, but you've grown rapidly and significantly more than they have in the last 30 years or so. And that makes the challenge even greater. Compounding it is the geographic spread of your community. You're not quite as concentrated as they are in a smaller area, and that makes it a little bit more challenging to use a ploy like that to get people more engaged. I think what you really need is, it's almost like a buddy system or a chavruta. One of the we didn't ask questions about specific barriers to engagement on your study, but one of the things we found from asking such questions in other communities is one of the biggest barriers is people feel like they're not going to know anybody when they go to a program, and particularly in the open-ended comments at the end of the survey in your community, that was something that we heard a bit about. A lot of people felt like they had a hard time breaking into established social circles, and so it's something that might be worth trying. You set up a buddy system, give people somebody they already know well, who can go to programs with them, and then even if they don't know anybody, they'll have somebody to talk to, they'll have somebody to hang around with at the program, but at least they'll be at the program. I think you just need to try a lot of things. The engagement level is relatively low, and so really you have nowhere to go but up. You have to sort of throw the noodles at the wall and see what sticks.
I'm going to give a slightly different answer, although it's consistent with Matt's comment, and that is comes out of my work. I spent a lot of time studying Birthright Israel, Taglit Birthright Israel, studied summer camps, studied Jewish life on college campuses. Judaism is engaging with other people, and for people who come with not a lot of experience doing that, finding ways to give them intensive experiences. So in some ways, short, intensive experiences are probably more valuable to do what Matt was suggesting ultimately, to build the social networks that are at the heart of building a community, engaging people, giving them a sense, and whether you use Shabbat and Shabbat dinners, whether you use retreats, whether you use travel programs, whatever, those intensive programs where people come in contact with one another in a context filled with value and meaning, that's how you build a community. Specifically, how each of the organizations in the community does it is going to be a bit different. Others?
I have one question that popped in my mind based on those comments. Have you done a study recently of Austin?
No.
Okay. Because it just kind of seems, because Orlando, to me, having lived in other places, seems like such a unique city in and of itself, compared to, when you take the development in the recent history, it's such an accelerated pace, and the sort of political leanings, and it just, there aren't that many cities that are like Orlando.
Right. Austin's a little bit, is an interesting place, and one of the pieces of it that I know is the Dell campus, which is for me was, well, the first time I went there was kind of interesting because it had a Jewish community center, but it also had 2 synagogues, the Federation offices, the offices of other Jewish organizations. It had a diverse set of institutions who were all sharing the same campus. Now, having a Michael Dell behind you made it a little bit easier to do. But I think Austin has the same issue of it's this huge place, and getting from one side to another is non-trivial. And building a sense of community is different. Although this multi-purpose campus, at least for the people who come to the campus, seem to be doing its work of, if you will, building community.
I have a question on here from a participant. Of the 7% of the LGBTQ population, what is their percentage of involvement? Do you guys know that?
Dr. Boxer, do you know offhand?
I don't know offhand. I believe what the issue is statistics is literally a numbers game. You need a vast number of respondents to be able to do any kind of reliable statistical analysis. And at 7% of the population, there just weren't enough LGBTQ respondents to be able to break them down in any way that we would trust the results and present the data to you and encourage you to make decisions based on them.
Stay tuned because we're trying by putting together the data from a dozen or more of our studies to have enough people to look at groups like the LGBTQ identified group and actually to answer questions like their level of engagement and so on. Yes?
Have you done Vegas?
We haven't done Las Vegas.
Someone else has, though.
But someone else has.
The last one was in, it was about 15 years ago?
At least 10 years ago, yeah.
It's probably a different city now.
And it's a different community.
Yeah.
I've spent some time out there, and I've spent some time working with the Federation out there, but it's a different community. They have an even better sponsor of many of their programs in terms of resources. Other questions, comments? Well, if not, and nothing else online.
Nothing else online.
So.
Oh, wait, hold on. What sparks your recommendation that organizations should work more together?
Matt, do you want to do that one as well?
Sure. So a lot of it comes out of the just from talking to people who did the survey, both in terms of their responses to the open-ended questions at the back, and I probably got emails from about 150 people who took the survey. My email address is splashed all over our website connected to the study, and I hear from an awful lot of people. Phone calls as well. I'm usually the one who gets the angry phone calls from people who want to know how did we get their contact information, and I convince them to do the survey. One of the really very dominant themes that I heard from people who got in touch with me, and from what I saw in the open-ended responses, was that Jewish organizations in the community are often very competitive with each other and not often enough cooperating with each other. And there was a generalized sense that the community could accomplish more of its goals if people worked toward common purposes. If synagogues would work together rather than competing for members, if cultural organizations would work together towards common purposes rather than, we want you to come to our program, not go to their program. It was just a generalized sense that came out of the data we collected. And from talking to some of our key informants in the community about the findings we were seeing, without naming names, they seem to validate that was a legitimate criticism of some parts if not necessarily all parts of the community. And so, look, and it's also something that we see in a number of other communities where engagement levels are higher. Sometimes high engagement numbers are a product of collaboration. The places where everybody is working together to boost everyone up. The expression "a rising tide floats all boats." This is what it's made for, and it was just not the sense that we were getting from the data that was happening in your community.
I'd also say, I made the comment before about online connections and how they work best for the people who are already connected. For those who are already connected, and for those for whom their practice doesn't involve or allows use of the internet on Shabbat, for example, you now have the potential to zoom in, tune into services almost anywhere in the world. What communal organizations have to do, learn to deal with that reality, work with national organizations as well as other local organizations. My sense is that there's an effective collaboration with PJ Library to provide books for young children. What's the similar connection with One Table or with Birthright Israel? And I know most of the programs, the national and even the local programs for young adults, you have a very high percentage of people who've been to Israel on educational programs. How are you working together, working with the organizations that sponsor those trips to engage people? So that's some of it. Okay, thank you. Matt Boxer, thank you. Happy to answer any one-on-one questions that people have. Again, thanks, and thanks for the technical assistance tonight.
One more time.